Hello, this is Unexplained America, and I'm your host, Lisa. Quick business before we get started. So go to the website to connect with me on all the platforms or send me an email, but the website is unexplainedarkansas.com. And you can reach me at unexplainedarkansas@gmail.com. And all of that information is in the show notes. Love it if you would like, subscribe, leave a comment, whatever you want to do. Just let me know. Reach out to me. So this episode is on the serial killer Richard Ramirez. I think it's understood. I think we all know who he is, what he did, how horrific it is. Warning, this episode is brutal. His crimes were brutal, also his upbringing. There will be sexual assault mentioned, sexual and physical crimes against children as well mentioned, and this will be a two-parter. Just hang in there. There's a lot to cover. And over the course of around 15 months, a serial killer named Richard Ramirez terrorized the communities of LA in the 1980s, finally being named and arrested in August of 1985. His crimes included 13 murders, plus, we'll get into that, but also attempted murders, rapes, sexual assaults, burglaries. He was the Night Stalker, and he was pure evil. How did he get that way? That is always a huge question after he committed his crimes. That was a huge question. Like, where did it all go wrong? Where did he go wrong? What happened to him? So we're going to take a deep dive into his family history, and it is extremely telling, at least it was to me. Richard, born Ricardo Ramirez, was born the fifth and final child of Julian and Mercedes Ramirez. Now, we're going to start with Julian. Now, Julian was born in Camargo, Mexico in 1927. He would come to be a very large, powerful, handsome man. Like, he would grow into that. And he grew up in a very poor farming family. His mother had died when he was just 12 years old, and he was the oldest male child of 8 children. His own father, Jose Ramirez, had a tremendous temper that he did not hold back on his children, as did his father, Inacia. Now, Jose and Inacia would beat Julian and Julian's siblings for quote-unquote disciplinarian purposes, which this arrangement at the time in Mexico during that time, it was very common in families. It was very common for children to get, quote unquote, beaten, disciplined very harshly by their parents. But the lines blurred due to the insane tempers of both men. And Julian's punishments were long, they were often, and they were hard when they happened, and not just for disciplinary purposes. Now, in fact, Inacia, Julian's grandfather, actually beat him the most frequently, like even more than Jose, his own father. Now, this caused Julian to be very quiet and withdrawn. You can only imagine. I can imagine. Now, by the time Julian was 14, again, he grew to be a very large, powerful man. He was very strong, and he was bigger or as big as his father and grandfather. So his father went to beat him with a belt one day, and he pulls the belt away from him and said, "No, you won't hit me ever again." In Mexico, during this time frame, the defiance of a child against their parents was huge. Like, it was a crime punishable by death. That seems insane. Jose, I guess they decided not to do that. They did not, turn Julian in for this crime. In fact, Jose and Inacia did stop beating Julian, okay? And really, Julian didn't require punishments. Like, he was not a bad kid. He was literally the epitome of a good son. He was a good sibling. He did and always had worked really hard to provide for his siblings and to take care of the family. He did everything he could. He went to church every Sunday. He had an extremely strong faith in Jesus Christ. He never stole. He didn't smoke. He didn't curse, and he rarely drank. Like, he tried to follow not only his moral compass, but just, the responsibilities of family. So morally and ethically, he tried his best. Now, he did quit school by first grade. Poor guy. first grade to work on the farm. They needed him. They're a poor farming community. This was not unheard of at that time. So he did not go to school, but he worked the farm, and it was very tough and it was very laborious. And Camargo at that time was like a super primitive small town in Mexico. It was dusty, it was dirty, it had no like railway going through it, it had no electricity, at least to their, farm. It was just very poor and very basic and just the very simplistic community and really a tight knit community. Like everybody in the community either knew of each other, or were related. Now, Julian actually met his wife, Mercedes, when he was 14. So Mercedes was actually born in Rockyford, Colorado, and she was one of 7 children. And her family name was Munez. Now, her family life was really quite opposite Julian's. Like, she grew up not with a lot of money like him, but she grew up with a lot of love. Obviously, she was born in the United States, so it was just a different, she didn't grow up in this primitive town of Camargo. By 1940, for sure, Mercedes' mother, Guadalupe, she moves the family, like the whole family, to Camargo, Mexico, because she wanted to avoid the draft for her sons. Like, she did not want her sons going into World War II. That's what was going on, World War II. Mercedes was actually like introduced and befriended by Julian's sisters, and they would hang out. He knew of her. She was friends with his sisters. Now, Julian and Mercedes, although they knew each other, of course, they did not date until later on, like until they were about 18 or so. In 1946, one of Mercedes' brothers, his name was Nachos, or went by Nachos, moved to Juarez, Mexico, which was a bustling border town very near El Paso, Texas. And this would have been about 500 miles north of Camargo. That's how much more deep in Mexico Camargo was, okay? So it was quite a ways. And the Munez family, being born in Colorado, they did have American citizenship. So it was very easy for them to go back and forth between Juarez and then El Paso. Like, that wasn't an issue. And the work opportunities there were just so much better than in Camargo. So that's why Nachos moved there. So by August of 1947, Guadalupe made the decision to move the whole Munez family to Juarez. So Mercedes and Julian were split apart by this move. Now, she did, Mercedes, that is, did not like Juarez. At that time, the town, it was a border town. It was really dangerous. Juarez was on the Mexican, side of it instead of the American side. So it was just a very dangerous town. It had a lot of just seedy activity, lots of drugs, gambling, prostitution. It was just dangerous, the things that go along with those activities. Now, she and Julian would write to each other. Of course, they're 500 miles apart. And it didn't speak of if he had a phone. He didn't really have electricity, so he probably didn't have a phone to talk to her, but they would write each other. Now, again, remember, Julian only finished maybe even first grade, maybe not even first grade. So he struggled with this writing back and forth. However, he did get help from his sisters. And so he did, learn to communicate, read and write, and communicate with Mercedes. I think I mentioned this later on, but I'm going to mention this right now. They, 100%, speak Spanish only, okay? They do not speak English. Now, Julian gets drafted into the Mexican army during this time. However, he gets sick kind of right away. He doesn't spend a lot of time in the army. In fact, he comes down with a scarlet fever, and so they discharge him and they send him home. And of course, he's this big, powerful guy. And now, after contracting scarlet fever, he is weak. He is very weak. And so one of his sisters, named Augustine, she nurses him back to health. So he's dealing with this. This is where he's at, Camargo, okay? So after Julian returns to health, so his father is utilizing him to still work and help out the family on the farm. Now, Julian wants to leave. He's in love with Mercedes. He wants to be with her. So he actually proposes to her via letter, and she says yes. And this is not pleasing to either side of the family, okay? Guadalupe felt like Julian was not good enough for Mercedes. He lacked skills, education, and money. This is according to Guadalupe. And then the Ramirez family, like, they didn't like the Munoz family. They felt like they were stuck up, thought they were better than everybody else. Like, they didn't like them. So both sides of the family were not pleased about this. Neither one of them, liked this. Now, and probably his sisters, because they had liked Mercedes. Now, in August of 1948, against the family's wishes, of course, Julian leaves Camargo and he moves to Juarez. He and Mercedes marry literally on the 8th of August, 1948. So as soon as he gets there, they kind of do their thing. They have a very simple, city hall type situation marriage, and there's literally just a few friends there, and zero of the family is there. Both agree on what their wants are. They want a large family, and Julian vows that his children, unlike him, will not get beaten. That's what Julian vows. But they both want a big family. They both want kids. They just want to do well. And Julian, he goes to work. He goes to work at a clothing factory there, and this is in Juarez. And then Mercedes is working as a housekeeper in El Paso. So again, these towns are like back to back. These, there's a border between them, but people are going back and forth. And again, Mercedes has, citizenship. So Mercedes, you know how she feels about Juarez. She doesn't like it. She wants to move to Texas. She wants to be living in El Paso, not comfortable in Juarez. So they do move into El Paso. Now, Guadalupe is there, other family, and at this time, she has warmed to Julian. He's proven himself to be hardworking, ambitious. He loved Mercedes, and he treated Mercedes really well. And because they lived so close to Guadalupe, they got to spend time with her. And they did spend time. They were very family oriented. So that was good in Guadalupe's eyes. Very shortly here, they got married in August 48. And so they are pregnant. They are having their first child. And they call him Reuben. And it is a son named Reuben. He is born, and he actually has some issues whenever he's born. Like, he has lumps all over his head and neck. The doctors don't know what the lumps are. They don't know what's wrong with him. And in the days right after his birth, he is literally fighting for his little baby life. Like, it's so serious that they call a priest in to give final rites 2 different times. Like, they really think he's not going to make it. Like, he's not going to live. Now, both Mercedes and both Julian are very strong in their faith, and they fall down on their knees and they just pray for God to take care of Reuben. God provides, and baby Reuben recovers, and the lumps actually disappear. No explanation, no idea what's going on. Now, a little side note, Julian and Mercedes didn't really know anything about this at this time. There was the Los Alamos in New Mexico, which was where there's a government site going on, and they were doing nuclear testing. Now, the nuclear fallout, depending on the winds, was happening in El Paso during this time. Like, they were only 200 miles apart. And so a lot of the doctors were kind of aware, because they were seeing a lot of birth defects with newborn babies at this time, like in this time frame in El Paso. And they knew that the fallout was happening. I mean, it was just something that they could physically, like, actually see the fallout coming out of the sky. And, it would be particles on everything. So what is going on during this time frame. Afterwards, there was kind of the word was starting to spread about this nuclear fallout and the connection to newborn babies. Now, I mentioned already that the Ramirez, they did not speak English. Like, they did not speak it. Everybody around them spoke Spanish, and that's what they spoke. And it's unclear if even later on in their years, if they did learn English. I mean, I would think that they did, but maybe it was just like, enough to get by. But they were not bilingual, okay? They did want their children to be, though. Very important for them to speak English. Now, just 2 months after they have Reuben, Mercedes is pregnant again. And she does give birth to another son, and his name is Jose, and they would call him Joseph. Now, Julian and Guadalupe, they are ecstatic. Like, having 2 boys especially in a row and being the first of the children, was evidently a very good omen in their culture. So they were just thrilled. Now, unfortunately, poor Joseph is born with, an affliction. By the time he's one, after numerous doctor's visits, they are sent to a specialist, and he is diagnosed with a disease where his bones are growing curved, and it causes him a great deal of pain. And that's why they went to a doctor's to begin with. Like, all he would do is cry, cry, and cry, and cry. Now, Joseph would continuously, throughout his, growing years, have to have surgeries to correct this, to kind of, because literally his bones were growing curved. And this was obviously an issue for him walking. It affected, everything there. So he did have to have the surgeries, and then he had to have special shoes. And he was able to walk, but it was always with a limp. His walk was always not right. And he would always have issues with, movement. So now, by the time that Julian and Mercedes were aware of this nuclear fallout going on, or possibly being responsible for not only Reuben's lumps and then, Joseph's, situation with those legs, but nothing appears, nothing appears to happen with the government or otherwise to help this issue. Yes, nuclear fallout is going to be a problem, but it wasn't something that the government did anything about. And in fact, and not until 1963 were there certain laws put in place, okay, about the nuclear activity. Nothing is done, and this is on people's minds, but they're still, they're just kind of hoping and praying that nothing is wrong with their babies. And so far as, they want a large family, so they're going to, continue to try to get their large family. Julian, he did want to make more money for his growing family, and then they also had, Joseph's medical bills to think of. So he did take a job in El Paso at a construction company. However, Julian did not have his U.S. citizenship. So in 1952, like, he was working, an immigration border guard show up at his construction site where he is, and they're going around asking for people to show them their papers, like their immigration papers. Well, he didn't have any, so he was like, I don't have them. So they literally load him up. They drove him to his apartment where Mercedes was with the boys, and they literally loaded the whole family up and all of their belongings, and then they proceeded to drive them across to Juarez and drop them off. Like, they didn't care that Mercedes and the boys were citizens. They didn't listen to anything. Their landlord had tried to step in, like, nothing. They just loaded them up and then dropped them off with all of their stuff. In Juarez, again, this is not a safe situation. Like, they moved for a reason. So they do have, Guadalupe. So what happens is Julian's like, okay, you need to get the boys and you safely to Guadalupe's. So she literally has to walk the children to Guadalupe's place from where they dropped them off and just pray that nothing happens to them, okay? And Julian's sitting there with their stuff, just by the side of the road, having to protect their belongings and just praying that, she makes it to her mom's house, okay? So luckily, they make it safely there, and then they bring back trucks to load everything up and pick up Julian, okay? So they end up, moving to Guadalupe, having to move into Guadalupe's, and then Julian's stuck. Like, he needs work, and he obviously can't work in El Paso. So he decides to go to the city hall there in Juarez. And when he did that, like, he actually met up with an old friend who was there, who was actually working as a policeman for the city. So he told Julian he could definitely get him a job, like, no problem. Again, Julian is a very strong, put together, and young man. Like, he's what they're looking for. So they literally swear him in right away, and he really loved the work. He loved his work. He had experience from his army time working with firearms, and so he was kind of put in the department kind of over the firearms, like training the other policemen how to handle and use and then clean the weapons. Mercedes, of course, she's a skittish woman. I get it. I would say I am too. She's a worrier. She wasn't thrilled about this work because she knew how dangerous it was. And again, Juarez was like a very, like almost a Wild West little kind of place. And all of the criminal activities, they really targeted the police as far as like directing their, danger to their, retaliation and such. Like they didn't care for the police because there was a lot of criminal activity going on. So she wasn't thrilled about this job, even though Julian loved it. She did not love it. She was not happy about it. Well, right away, again, right after, they have Reuben, they have Joseph. Well, Mercedes is pregnant again, and she does have another baby boy, and he would be Robert. Now, Mercedes urges Julian to please get his U.S. papers so that he could be done working with Juarez, done with the police work. Like, she just wanted him to be doing something else, and she definitely wanted him to be a U.S. citizen. So he does get his papers, and he is able to completely, separate himself from Juarez, and he finds work with the railroad. Now, this work does take him away from home, but he is making a lot, better money. He has good benefits. It's a good job. Now, Mercedes, she goes to work for a factory named Tony Llama, and they make the famous Texas boots, okay? So her job there was working with just some really strong chemicals that made the colors for painting the boots. And at that time in this factory, you can imagine, this would have been, they got married in 48, so probably by like 1950 or so, like there's no ventilation, there's nothing, she is there 5 days a week with no mask, no ventilation, and she does have some side effects, okay? And other women that are working with her are also having some side effects. And of course, this is, the mid 1950s or something, they don't have any clue about how toxic the chemicals benzene and xylene are. And those are the chemicals that she's working with. Now, she does get pregnant, and she's still working there with a baby girl this time. And she has Ruth. So this is her 4th child. She finally has a girl. Now, a little side note, I'm just going to plug this. So Julian has a sister named Victoria, one of his sisters. She has a son the same age as Reuben, so the same age as their oldest. And his name is Miguel. He will be called Mike, and he will come up quite a bit, okay? Now, Mercedes is working hard. Julian is working hard. And they are working very hard because they really want to provide for their children. Like, they want every opportunity that they didn't have. They want to do well for their family, and they really want to purchase a house. So they do get their dream. They do get to, purchase a home. They get to live their American dream. And so this is very important to them. Now, Mercedes, of course, is still working in the factory, still no better conditions. And she is literally having, really bad issues. Like, she has dizzy spells and such, and there are times when she can't even like stand up at the job, like she has to take a minute, probably because she's just suffocated with these chemicals. And then even on the weekends, like herself and then some of the other women, like they find that when they get away from the factory, like of course they feel better, like they can breathe, like the dizziness falls away, but then they're having other symptoms. They're literally having withdrawals from the chemicals, because then when they go back to work, they're better. So it's like they're having headaches and sick at their stomach when they're not near the chemicals, but then they're also sick when they are near the chemicals. So it's like this vicious cycle going on. Keep in mind, so this is 1959. Her oldest child would have been born like in 49, okay? So, and of course she had the kids kind of boom, boom, boom. She gets pregnant again, and she is working at the factory, and this pregnancy is absolutely terrible for her. She is so sick, so very sick. So she does go to the doctor, and the doctor's like, look, between the chemicals and the standing on your feet all day, like, you just can't do this. You're going to hurt the baby. You're going to hurt yourself and the baby. You've just got to quit working in order to keep herself and the baby safe. Like, she does quit work, but by the time she quits, it's like in the 5th month. She does quit, and on February 29th, 1960, I will say February 29th, it is a leap year. It is documented as leap year. Now, the birth certificate will say February 28th, but everything else says that the birth happened on the leap year on the 29th. Now, Mercedes gives birth to Ricardo Leyva Munez Ramirez, otherwise known as Richard, so they will call him Richard. And actually, to the family, they call him Richie, little Richie. Now, Ruth, like, she absolutely falls in love with this little baby brother. Like, her other brothers are mean to her, and she could care less about them. But when Richie comes along, like, she actually, like, falls in love with him. Like, she loves him. It is like her little baby doll. After Mercedes gives birth to Richard, she does end up going back to work for Tony Lama. She still wants everything that they have. She still needs money. So there was a lawsuit by some of the employees regarding the chemicals and such and their effects. So now the company is ventilating the factory very well, and they're providing masks for those who need it. Now, Mercedes, she goes back to work, and she does stop experiencing all those horrible side effects from the chemicals. So the ventilation worked for her. Now, of course, the Ramirez, like I said, they were ambitious. They wanted things. They wanted things for their, children. They really wanted their children to have opportunities. And so, of course, she's working. Julian's working. They do live in a very, modest, nice home in El Paso, in a very modest neighborhood. The thing about it is she's got small children. So she's got, kids ranging from 11 down. So they do always have someone that stays with the children. Okay. So they do hire someone to stay with the children, but they're still not home. There's still not a great deal of supervision happening within the household. Okay. Julian was overall a very good husband, and he was a good father. He loved his family. However, he did have his father and grandfather's temper, and his kids would recount later, like, he would get angry at the most trivial of things. Like, in his anger, they said typically turn to items other than people or even himself. So there was an instance where he was working on his car. It wasn't going the way he wanted, and he literally, like, started banging, his head against, this tool that he was using, like, bloodied himself. So he would just, like, absolutely lose his temper, and he probably was turning his anger to these objects, to himself, to keep himself from hitting his children. But he had this just horrible anger, like, quick, horrible anger. And his children were, scared. I mean, they saw this, and it was scary for them, obviously. Like, it was something going on in the house, and it was not pleasant. So he had his anger issues, and as much as he didn't want to do that, it was like it was in him, and he would just get into a blind rage. And of course, he didn't turn it on his children at first. Now, baby Richard, he was there. He was a good baby. He didn't cry. They said he was very easy, and he loved music. So he's a very good baby. Now, Reuben, again, he's much older than Richard. He was about 11 by this time, and he begins running with a rough crowd, so to speak. Now, they are literally stealing. I mean, they're very young. They're not even teenagers. They are stealing. They are sniffing glue. And again, both parents are really preoccupied with providing for the family. There's, again, not a lot of supervision going on. And you can imagine the family is paying for help to watch, baby Richard, and then probably, like, Ruth. But the other boys, they're just autopilot. They're just doing whatever they want to do. They're going around the neighborhood. They're with other kids, and they're just getting into all sorts of things, okay? They're not doing what they need to do. By the time Richard is 2, so Richard is 2, he's still under the care of a babysitter. There is an instance where he climbs a very heavy wooden dresser. He is trying to get a toy or something that was on top of the dresser. The dresser falls on top of him and it literally knocks him unconscious for 15 minutes or so. He is taken to the hospital. He gets 30 stitches for the wound on his head from the dresser, like fell on his head, and he had a concussion. Julian was angry, very angry about this. They let this babysitter go. They get another babysitter for Richard. So this happens. This is an item that could be telling for Richard, and we'll get into maybe why. So by the time Richard is 6, so he's 6, Reuben is around 16 or so, and Reuben, by this time, he is continuously in trouble. And he is running around with cousin Mike, okay? He is part of the group. And they're stealing, they're doing drugs, they're doing all kinds of things. Well, one night, Reuben and Mike actually get arrested. They had stolen a car. Julian finds out, and when he gets home, he beats Reuben. He beats Reuben until he is black and blue. Even though Julian had vowed not to do such, like he really did not want to think of himself as doing that. But he also could not believe that his son was a thief. And this just turned he could not control his rage. He felt utterly betrayed by Reuben and by his activities, and he felt like he deserved and warranted this beating. But Julian was out of control when he beat it. And, the whole family is there. The whole family is witnessing this. And of course, Mercedes, has to intervene. And so this is just great. And now it's directed at the children. And of course, Richard sees this. Richard's watching, and he is absolutely frightened of his father. Like, absolutely frightened. Now, Reuben continues to be in trouble, and he continues to be beaten by Julian. And again, the whole family is witnessing this. The house is they're not in good shape. Like, it's just trouble and beatings, and Mercedes just trying to stop the beatings, and it's just a horrible turning point for the Ramirez home. And of course, Richard is very young in dealing with this. Now, Joseph, the second boy, Joseph was never a problem, okay? Joseph was never a problem. But Robert, the third son, so he follows Reuben right to a T. Like, he just does whatever Reuben is doing, and he is also getting in trouble, doing all the drugs, stealing, and he is also being beaten by Julian. So now you've got both of these boys that are just out of control. Julian's out of control. Julian's beginning to drink. Of course, he had started out just doing the best he could, and the more that he worked off, and just the older he got, and the more his temper got, and then his drinking, and then the boys, it was just this horrible storm. So he just became a very bitter, enraged man. That's all that Richard gets to see of his father. He just sees his father losing his temper and beating his siblings. So that's all that Richard knows of Julian, okay? And again, he is frightened. This is the household that he's grown up with. Also, at this same time, Richard, around the time he was, 5 or 6, he suffers a second large head trauma, okay? He was on a playground. He was running towards the swing set. It said that he was running towards Ruth. She was in the swing, and he just collides with her foot. Like, her foot just hits him just right in the head, and he ends up with more stitches and another concussion. He ends up in the hospital over this one. So there's 2 big head traumas in his youth. Now, fast forward, Richard has grown. He is in fifth grade by this time, and he has his first seizure. Now, he is in class. The classmate recalls this happening, and he was just kind of sitting in his chair, one minute kind of looking at the classmate. He was a friendly guy. He was kind of turned around, so it wasn't weird. Well, in the next moment, all of a sudden, he falls out of his chair to the floor, and he begins cursing, and he is shaking. And of course, this is, horrible. And so kids run out, they get the school nurse. The nurse calls Mercedes, and Mercedes does get Richard to the hospital. And they do state that Richard had a grand mal seizure and that he does have epilepsy. Now, they don't give any advice. They don't even give him any kind of medication. All they do is state to Mercedes that he will grow out of it. That's all that's stating. And I don't know if it's the 1970s, I wouldn't think, or if it's maybe just the language barrier, but she doesn't get a lot of assistance on this. And Ruth would recount later on how after this initial seizure happens, like he has some seizures, and he would literally have these bouts. She called them long bouts of just staring spells. Like he would sit and stare for about 5 to 10 minutes without moving. Like he would just be completely still and he wouldn't talk and he's just staring. And what they didn't even realize that he was having like what they call petite mal seizures. So he was just having a small seizure and it was just on a small scale. But he was continuously having these seizures, okay? So later on, obviously after he's committed his crimes and just like we're doing today, people were diving deep into his life and deep into just his psyche or whatever, but they do later on diagnose Richard with temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, a Dr. Gershwin way back had published findings, and he had what was called Gershwin syndrome that stated certain attributes to people with this temporal lobe epilepsy that they typically, this is talking about typically, and they relate this to Richard later on, but typically these people are excessively aggressive. They are hyposexual. They have, some of them have a very altered sexuality, and some of them actually are very into writing, like literally writing. And so alleged people, it states, like that had this Gershwin syndrome is said to be Van Gogh, Julius Caesar, Napoleon, Dostoevsky. You've got different levels there, but that's what they say that Richard was, that he did have this temporal lobe epilepsy. Now, early in school, Richard, he was a good student. He was bright. His brothers, like Joseph wasn't a bad student, and Ruth wasn't bad. I don't think she was good, but of course Reuben and Robert were not good students at all. But Richard, he was a good student. He was smart. He really liked to make other kids laugh, and that was the only thing that was ever said to be like a disciplinary issue for him, was just making kids laugh or cutting up or whatever. He worked hard. He did what he was supposed to do when it came to classes and following directions and all that. So he was not an issue at all. The girls thought he was kind and handsome. Really, by the time that Richard was 13, though, around 1973, this was all going to change. So his grades were going to slip and he would stop paying attention. Now, later on, when all the family would be, like I said, they're going to be deeply interviewed and scrutinized and such. Well, Reuben and I believe it was Reuben and Robert both, like they had been put in quote unquote like a slow class or whatever, and they stated that they had a teacher named Mr. McMahon that was over these classes. And Reuben and Robert, when they were not only in school but out of school, they stated that they were sexually abused by, McMahon, that he would abuse them at school. He would even like come over to the house with the guise of helping them, quote unquote, with their grades. and evidently abused them at home. He would even take them, to his home, evidently. I mean, and this was from them. And they said that he would perform sex acts on them. He would make them perform sex acts on him. Like, he was just a pedophile. And they stated, like, when asked if Richard was sexually, abused by this man and molested, like, they said that they didn't know. They figured that, by this time, I mean, he was definitely around McMahon, and so they thought that he could have been, but he would have been very young, is what they relayed. And then Richard, whenever he was asked himself about McMahon, he just said if he was abused, he didn't. We don't know what happened there, but according to Reuben and Robert, that was definitely happening to them. By the time Richard was 10 years old, so he was smoking pot. He was already dabbling in drugs by the time he was 10. And again, there's just not any supervision. Mercedes and Julian, in their minds, they were doing the best they could. They were working extremely hard, but there just wasn't supervision. The kids did what they want to do. They would run around, and the older siblings. So Richard was introduced to a lot of things that his older siblings were doing that a, quote unquote normal 10-year-old would not have been introduced to. By the year 1973, now the older kids, they are out of the home. They had moved away. Reuben, Robert, Joseph, Reuben and Robert actually did not finish high school, which was another thing that Julian was just disgusted about. Julian, really wanted his kids to get an education. Now, Joseph, he finished high school and he was bright, but he didn't want to go on to college. Like, he didn't want to do that. And so Julian was very, disappointed with all of that. He really put all of his hope that Richard would get an education, do really well for himself. That's what Julian really hoped for. Now, Ruth was still living at home with Richard. So it was Ruth and Richard at home. And again, Ruth, from the very beginning, has always supported and always protected Richard. Like, she was his older sister, and she loved him, and she protected him as much as she could. Now, Richard is in junior high, and he is, so the whole boy family there, the Ramirez genes, they were very good genes. They were like Julian. Some of the boys were just strong and, built or whatever. And Richard was more, like, he was very strong. And they all had, like, really big hands. Like, he had really big hands. He had big feet. And he was strong and he was agile. He was very fast, but he was more lanky. Richard was more lanky. He wasn't, like, bulky or anything like that. But he was fast and he was very good athlete. He was a very good athlete. And he was playing football, and then he was loving playing football, and he was even placed as, like, quarterback for his team. However, he was still having seizures, and he did have a seizure during the game, and so his coach, after that, removed him from the team, which was said to devastate Richard. And Ruth really felt like this was the moment that she thought very profoundly changed Richard, like, turned him and made him go down a different path, a darker path or whatever. That's what she felt. Obviously, it would have impacted Richard, and obviously it didn't impact him for the positive, but there was something else going on, and we're about to get into that. So, remember cousin Mike. Of course, he's the same age as Reuben. And so if Richard is 13, I mean, Mike is like 23. He's like a 23-year-old, 24-year-old. So he had actually come back to El Paso, and this is around, 1972 at the end of it, 1973 time frame. So he had gone to war. He had gone off to the Vietnam War. He came home a decorated soldier, and he had tons of decorations from the Vietnam War. He had fought heavily in the Viet Cong. He was a part of the whole thing. Well, he came home with some horrific amount of stories, and he was gladly conveying these war stories to like a 12, 13-year-old Richard. And he was detailing these stories to Richard. And he was discussing in full detail, whatever, about how he killed. And he enjoyed to kill. He enjoyed war. He liked war. He liked to kill people. And then he also told, little Richard about raping the Viet Cong people. So he described that he had killed about 25 of them and raped them as well. Now, not only did he enjoy talking about it, he had pictures. So, and again, this is obviously Richard is very impressionable. He's already, doesn't have a good relationship with Julian. He's just scared of Julian. His other brothers have moved on, but obviously they introduced him to a lot of things he shouldn't have. And now you have Mike. And Richard is looking up to Mike. He is listening to all these stories, and he's listening and he's liking what he's hearing. And obviously he's very impressionable. So, like I said, Mike wasn't only talking about these horrific war stories and about how he was killing him, about what he did and the raping, but he literally had evidence. He had taken pictures, like photographs, while in Vietnam, and he had boxes and boxes of black and white photos. Literally, one photo had like these poor women, and they were at gunpoint in the photo, literally having to perform sex acts on Mike. Like, this is the type of photos, and there were tons more. And he was discussing this activity in full detail, and again, showing Richard this. So this is what Richard is seeing and hearing as a 12, 13-year-old boy. Okay? This is absolutely sickening. Mike is sickening. Well, believe it or not, Mike is married. So Mike is married to a woman named Jessie, and they literally have 2 small children. So he has 2 small children. Now, Richard, of course, he's listening to this, and he is really at odds with his feelings about this. He's finding himself being aroused sexually and not repulsed by the photos that Mike is showing him. Now, Richard, with his older siblings, he had been exposed to girly magazines and such, but he had never been obviously exposed to something like this. And he was enjoying these pictures so much more than just the girly magazine photos. Like, he was enjoying it, and he didn't understand that. And he was very much in conflict with himself. I mean, he grew up in a very devout Catholic home. Okay, so, and he knew what God and Jesus Christ expected of him and his thoughts and his actions. And he knew in his head that they would not like this. They did not approve of this. They would not like my thoughts and desires here. And so this is really conflicting Richard. I mean, again, he is very young and listening to just this horribleness. So, again, his parents are always working. His older siblings are gone. Richard is spending more and more time with Mike. And all they do is drive around smoking pot and listening to Mike's horrific stories over and over. A grown man hanging out with a 12, 13-year-old, doing grown man things, doing horrific things, not just grown-up things, horrific things, riding around with Richard. It's insane to think about. But this is what's happening. Now, Julian had never liked Mike. Mike had been a part of the bad crowd that Reuben and Robert had run with when they were, younger. So he didn't like Mike. He was not a fan of Mike. But now, Mike was home. He was family. He was blood family, and that means a lot, to Julian. And he was a decorated war veteran now. And Julian didn't even realize or dive in. Of course, he didn't know how Mike truly was. He had no clue about the things that he was introducing Richard to. So he did. So Julian was aware that they were hanging out, and he was fine with it. He was like, Mike's, his cousin. It's fine. It's all good. Yeah. So that was happening. Now, Mike, in the meantime, is teaching Richard about killing, fighting, and just all the things that he learned in war. So everything that he learned in war, he is talking to Richard about, and Richard is just taking notes. I mean, he is really involved in this. Of course, he's listening to every single thing that Mike has ever said, and just really, it's getting in there. And it's not things that Richard needed to know ever. So, on May 4th, 1973, Richard was at Mike's house hanging out when Jessie came home from grocery shopping. Now, obviously, you can imagine her and Mike hadn't been getting along. Yeah, crazy. Now, namely, for all the reasons you can imagine, but on top of that, he wouldn't work. Like, he would not get a job. So she started complaining and yelling at him as soon as she walked in, and he told her to shut up. Like, he was like, shut up. And she would not. She would not stop. She was still complaining, yelling at him, get a job, blah, blah. So, and talking about how expensive, I'm sure, like, hey, this was expensive to go grocery shop. We have kids. Why don't you get a job? Well, he grabs his .38 caliber gun and he tells her, if you don't shut up, I'm going to shoot you. She defiantly dared him to shoot her. And he point blank raises his gun and shoots her right in the face. Close range, right in the face. The bullet enters right above her lip and exits the back of her head. I mean, her head just, yeah, you can imagine. This happens literally right in front of 13-year-old Richard and then Mike and Jessie's two small children, their two sons. Mike looks at Richard and says, do not say a thing. Do not say a thing. Like, warns him, do not say a thing. So Richard just goes, he just goes home. He does not say a word. He does, he is upset by this. He is, but he doesn't say a thing about it. He just doesn't. So he gets home like nothing happened. Well, Mike's mom calls Julian and tells him what happened and that she needed help and that she needed him to come down to the police station. So Julian goes, he takes Richard, and then Mike had asked Julian to grab some items from the apartment. So it was like Julian and Mercedes and Richard actually go to Mike and Jessie's apartment to get these things for Mike. And Julian doesn't allow for Mercedes to go into the house, but he lets Richard go into this apartment with him. And he literally takes Richard in, and there's blood. There's blood everywhere. There's, her blood is still there. And later on, Richard would state he was in a sense of awe and wonder at the smell of the blood. And just to see Jessie's things there and the blood left behind, and the fact that she was like there one minute and then not there the next minute, like he wasn't as like he was kind of upset. He was upset about it, but not really. He was more just in awe of the situation. Awe. So Mike goes on trial, and his defense pleads insanity due to his exposure to combat. And the jury feels sympathy for him, and they do find him innocent by reason of insanity. So instead of going to prison for shooting his, kid's mom in the face, he is committed to the Texas State Mental Hospital for treatments instead. Yes. So obviously this is a lot going on. After Jesse's murder, Richard pretty much loses all sense of care. Like, he really didn't care already for school. Like, he didn't care. But he is completely, not involved with school. He's completely not following instructions at home. He is just out. Like, he is done. They say that his hair grows long. He is literally just smoking pot all day. He's stealing. Julian is ranting and raving and, coming after him. And he didn't care. Like, Richard just, and they don't even understand. Like, they don't know that he was there. Like, they don't know that Richard saw this and that he was there. And I don't know what they would have done regardless, but they don't even realize that fact. So during this time, Reuben had been living in LA, okay? And Richard wanted to go see him. Julian and Mercedes didn't know what to do with Richard. They knew that he, his best friend Mike that he had been hanging out with is, gone. And of course, this horrendous, murder has happened. So even though they're not, happy with Ruben or whatever, they just know Ruben is in LA, and they go ahead and decide to send Richard out to visit Ruben in LA just to get maybe away from El Paso for a minute. They just, get away from the murder situation and just, yeah. So they think that this could be good. They have zero idea, how much. Maybe Ruben isn't like as bad, quote unquote, as Mike, but he is just as bad. And they have no idea what all Mike had exposed Richard to and what Ruben will, expose Richard to. So, Ruben is actually married. He has a baby son, so he's out there in LA. He also has a heroin addiction. And his job, quote unquote, was a professional thief. So he is literally involved with this like gang of street thugs and robbers, and all they do is rob homes and buy heroin. That's all they do. Now, when Richard gets to LA, Ruben literally takes him to burglarize homes with him. And he teaches him how to pick locks. He teaches him how, what to check for, make sure to check for dogs and motion sensors and how to, like, basically how to be a good thief. This is what he's learning. Okay. So we thought it is horrific what he learned from Mike, but it is definitely no better here in LA with Ruben. So this is what he's doing. So this time with Ruben, again, just like the time with Mike, is detrimentally bad for Richard, obviously. This is not good skills to learn, but he's learning them. So he goes back to El Paso after the visit, and of course, he just continues to not care. He continues to smoke pot. He's not going to school. He's enrolled, but he's not going. And then he also, he doesn't love his home life, and his home was very close to a cemetery. And so he relays later on that he really enjoyed, just grabbing up a sleeping bag, and he would go sleep in the cemetery just to get away from his house, just to get away from Julian, just to get away, because Julian was on his case. I mean, he wasn't doing what his parents wanted him to do. So Julian was after him too. So he would just sleep in the cemetery. He said he really found it peaceful. It wasn't scary to him. He loved to sleep in a cemetery, and he wanted to get away from his father. He also enjoyed hunting. So he did hunt. He had been taught to hunt. His brother said hunt. Like, he loved to hunt. He had a dog named Indio, and he would go out hunting. And in fact, he had had Indio actually since he was 3, and he loved this dog, like absolutely loved this dog. But he would take Indio, and they would go hunt, and he would shoot rabbits and such. And then it stated that he did really enjoy shooting the animals, and like he was a very good shot, but he really liked cutting the animals. So he would take a knife and actually cut the animals after he killed them, and he would enjoy seeing like the animal, the blood and whatever. So he also tried out karate. So he did learn a few basic moves, but like everything else, he didn't stick with it. So he tried it out, moved on. Now, unlike his brothers, so his brothers had loved to fight. His brothers were strong and they loved to fight, and they were always picking fights. Now, Richard was never picking fights. I mean, he was a loner. He wasn't social by any means, but he wasn't picking fights. Now, if he was prompted to fight, it said that he had a horrible temper like the rest of the men in his family, and he would just blind rage would catch on, and he would fight to win. And he was a good fighter, but he did not fight often. But if he did, he was going to win that fight. Now, the teachers and principals, when he was in high school and such, they remembered him as really actually being quiet, not a problem. They knew he wasn't a good student. They were like, he's not a good student, but it wasn't because he wasn't bright. It wasn't bright enough. He simply didn't care. So he was known as just being there, being quiet, not a problem. Like, he wasn't known to be a problem. Now, after spending that time with Reuben, coming back home to Julian was really tough. Like, after being away from Julian and coming back to Julian and dealing with Julian, like, he didn't like that. So he went to live with Ruth. And she had actually gotten married. She had moved out, gotten married. And her husband's name was Roberto Avila. Now, he was a very good looking man, but he had issues. Seems like every man that Richard has put around. And he was a pervert. He was a peeping Tom. And at first, Ruth didn't realize it. She just knew that this Robert, her husband, just wanted sex from her like all the time. She could not keep him satisfied. And he would go out like prowling at night, and she realized what he was doing, and it just wasn't a good, it was not a good marriage or whatever. Now, when Richard left to go live with Ruth, Julian was super upset that Richard had left, and Mercedes was absolutely heartbroken, but there was nothing they could do. Like, he was like, I'm out. Now, Richard, of course, he goes from hanging out with Mike, the rapist murderer, to hanging out with Reuben, the heroin addicted burglar. And now he's hanging out with Roberto, the peeping Tom, disgusting man. So Roberto had literally, like, he was a voyeur. Like, he was going around the neighborhood, like, looking in windows, whatever. He had mapped out his whole neighborhood, and he knew kind of everybody's situation. Like, he knew which windows, so to speak, were the best ones to look in. And so he literally would take Richard on these trips. Now, Ruth found out and threatened Roberto and told him to stop. And if he wouldn't stop, she was going to leave him. Well, he didn't stop. And so they do separate after they had married for about 2 years, and they do separate. Now, Richard does stay on with Ruth, and she kind of notates that Richard was one of those people that never slept. Like, he never slept. He was good on 2 to 3 hours of sleep at night. So he was always up. So he was prowling, and he had learned from Roberta. So Richard went on, to do the things that Roberto did. In fact, he's doing all the things that all the horrific men in his life have taught him to do. And he does go also, so he goes from doing, the marijuana into hard drugs during this time in high school. So he begins LSD and mushrooms. So now he's doing LSD and mushrooms, and he begins to actually break into people's homes to steal from them. And also to look at, and he's also doing the peeping Tom thing. So he kind of takes what he's learned from Reuben and from Roberto and kind of mesh those. And of course, he needs money for his drugs and different things. So he is breaking into homes, and he is, doing all the things. Now, he is also completely a loner. Obviously, he doesn't have any friends. He's not spending time with any, people his age. He has no good influences, and he's, not involved in like a church or not, everything that he's done that's good has kind of ended with like the football ended and such. But so there's just not anything good that he's spending his time on. He does spend time with family. Like, he does spend time with Ruth. He does, spend time with Joseph. Joseph had gotten married to a woman named Sophia. And Joseph, again, from the very beginning, he did not turn out like Mike, Reuben, or Robert. He was a devout Catholic, and he worked really hard, and he had actually gotten a really good job as a butcher. He had tried to, he does have this disability, and he had tried to get disability, but they said, if you can walk, you can work. So he did get a good job as a butcher. So he is married. He is stable. He is probably the one stable person, in Richard's life or whatever. So he does actually try to get Richard on at his job. Everybody can see that Richard is not going to school, but Richard goes to work with Joseph, and then after about a day and almost cutting off his thumb, he's done with that. So that did not work out. And Richard is continuing to have, of course, issues with his faith. He knows, he's like, Jesus would not approve of what I do. And all that Richard, begins to think of is Satan. He knows that he would be pleasing Satan. He's not pleasing Jesus, but he would be pleasing Satan. And so these are the things that he is starting to think about. He's starting to think more and more about Satan, the devil, and just that he's, pleasing him. Now, he is 15, and although he is technically enrolled at Jefferson High School there in El Paso, he's not attending class. I mean, he hasn't really been going for a while. And he does begin working at a Holiday Inn there in El Paso. And he does little odd jobs at the hotel, maintenance, luggage toting, whatever is needed on the property, like he does. Now, after about a month, he has a situation where he's in an elevator and he sees a cute teenage girl, and evidently he tells her she's pretty. Well, she goes and tells her parents, and then they call the manager, complaining about this. And so he's called in by the manager and told, do not hit on, our guests or their children ever again. Like, don't do that ever again. Now, at the same time, so he's kind of made some friends with some employees there. Well, an employee who had actually been let go gives Richard his passkey, which is just a passkey to all of the rooms, which is something that Richard didn't have and something that he didn't need. Well, this, of course, passkey can get him anywhere in the hotel. So he begins using this privilege and breaking into rooms to steal from the patrons staying at the hotel, literally while they're sleeping. And again, he doesn't sleep, so he's working like the night shift or whatever he's working. So he would literally sneak, like open the door, sneak in, on the floor. I mean, he knows how to do this. He's broken into houses or whatever, and he uses like a pin light to kind of so he can see, and he steals stuff off of their like the bedside table there in the hotel room. Like he would steal money and jewelry and just whatever he could grab. Now then he ups his ante. So not only is he breaking in, to steal, he begins breaking in on women in the hotel so he can watch them. He can watch them either sleeping, changing, or showering. So one night he breaks into a room and he finds a woman in there by herself and he assaults her. And he literally uses her own underwear and he takes it and he ties her up. Now, luckily, the woman's husband comes in. He had just been downstairs grabbing some food. So he comes in and he finds Richard, and he is just a huge man, and he beats Richard. He beats him badly to the point where Richard is just unrecognizable. So Richard is arrested, but he's taken to a hospital because literally, I mean, he is beaten bloody to a blade pulp. He gets 30 stitches to his lip, and he has both of his eyes blackened. You would think that this would like ring. Anyway, it doesn't. Of course they notify Mercedes. So Mercedes is notified and she gets Ruth, and then they go to Richard. Well, Richard lies to them, of course, and he tells them the woman invited him in and actually seduced him, and they had consensual relations. And then her husband came in and she's like, no, So they believe him. They just cannot believe that their baby Richie would do such a thing. So they don't even think that it's true. Now, the charges end up being dropped because the couple weren't from El Paso. They were from out of town and they refused to come back, to El Paso to go to court. So nothing is done. Nothing is done to him. It's almost like you almost wish that something was done. Although I don't know in Texas at this time what the juvenile situation was because he was a juvenile at that time. But nothing is done. Now, you'll never guess who's back. Mike. So it is 1977 by now. Mike is released from the hospital. He's literally only served 4.5 years. But the doctors felt like after extensive therapies, Mike was stabilized and that he deserved another chance. So Mike comes back. He takes up right where he left with Richard. Richard, of course, has no one. And so him and Mike are hanging out again. And by this time, Richard's not even talking to Julian. He is communicating with Mercedes, but him and Julian are not communicating at all. And Mike is still Mike. He still is doing the same things. He's discussing his, horrific war stories, and he's doing drugs. So that is all they're doing. Now, Richard is continuing on with burglarizing. That's like his quote unquote job. And Mike is aware of this. They openly discuss this, and Mike is giving Richard even more pointers regarding his burglary. So he tells him to make sure to stay away from gravel, stay away from clotheslines, garbage cans, and dogs. Now, Richard would do his work like he had kind of learned. If you go really early in the morning hours, like 2 plus, like 2 a.m. on, then that's when people are really deep in sleep. Like he literally knew exactly how to do this, guys. Like this is scary. And Mike had started calling Richard Dados or Fingers because of all the stealing that he was doing. That was like his nickname. That was his pet name. Now, Julian and Mercedes, they have no idea what's going on. Again, they don't know. They know that he's not doing well, but they don't know what all he's doing. And Richard has completely dropped out of school by 1977. And Richard would state later, it is easy thing to steal. Any jerk could do it, but to steal and not get caught ever, that's something else. So this is like his pride, and he takes pride in his ability to burglarize people and to steal. Like he just sees himself as a thief, and that's fine. Like he has no grief over that. That is what he does. And he also thinks of himself as like a Robin Hood, except he doesn't give any money to the poor. Yes, this is the mentality, guys. You can imagine. So in this time frame, he does actually get a girlfriend, or what the kids now would call a situationship. Her name is Nancy Avila, and she was a young girl that lived in the neighborhood of actually his parents. And she had like a huge crush on Richard. Like she wanted to be his girlfriend. Now they began talking, and she would actually, like, her parents would not, agree to this relationship, but she would have her parents drop her off at school and then have Richard come up and pick her up right behind them. So she doesn't actually go to school. They would just sneak around. And she was literally 15 and he was 17 at this time. And again, her parents did not approve. Now, she does say later on that he was very gentle with her. He never assaulted her. They did physical things, and she said that he was very nice. He was never mean, never awful, never put her, in a weird situation. Like he treated her totally different than he treated the people that like he spied on and eventually, who he assaulted. So he was very good to her. Now, by February of 1978, Richard was tired. He was tired of El Paso. His relationship with Nancy was over, and he wanted, to kind of get away. And Mike was no longer hanging out with him. Mike had actually remarried and was now fully addicted to heroin. So, with this happening, Richard is 18 now, and he decides that LA is the place he wants to be. He loved his visit when he had gone before. He loved the shadiness of downtown LA, and so he wanted out. So he decides to take with him a lot of pot that he had purchased actually in El Paso, and he decides that he can sell the pot for a lot more money in LA and then live on that. So that's what he decides to do. And then, of course, he had his backup plan, of course, of being a thief, and that's what he always would do for money. Now, he does get to LA. He does connect with Ruben, and Ruben and his wife, Susanna, are there. And one night, the two, like, he's staying with them, blah, 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 blah. And okay. So one night, while he's, staying with Ruben, some men break into Ruben's house, like his apartment. Now, between the two of them, they are able to take the men down. Like, they beat the men up and make them leave. However, it shakes up Ruben. It shakes up Richard. Richard goes and gets Ruben a 22. And so Ruben, puts the gun by his bed from then on out, just because he's afraid that those men are going to come back, and, he wants to have protection. Now, Ruben and Richard end up having a falling out because evidently Suzanne tells Ruben that Richard hit on her. So this was just a short-lived situation. Now, Richard, in the meantime, he is on his own downtown LA. He's stealing. He develops a full blown cocaine addiction. So he went from snorting cocaine to then putting it into a syringe and shooting it up directly into his veins to get an even, higher high, basically. Like he wanted a large dose and he wanted it to, he wanted to fill it. Now, his habit was costing him $1,500 a week. 15. I mean, this is the 80s. That is a lot of money. That's a lot of money now, much less then. And of course, it's just going into his veins. Now, in order to afford this habit, he has to burglarize. So endlessly. So during this time, he is just stealing and doing drugs. He does meet a woman who approached him to actually get her some PCP. And so he meets her, they do some drugs, that he gets her the PCP, and she takes him back to his apartment where she rebuffs his advances. He wants to, connect with her sexually. And she was like, no, she makes him leave. But instead of leaving, he goes and hides on the roof. He then, around 3 o'clock a.m., he just waits. He breaks into the window of her apartment. He then blinds her, gags her, and rapes her. And he's not arrested. She never, he's never caught. I don't even think she went to the police. This was just something that he would convey later. Now, Richard, he was stealing cars. He was stealing cars to sleep in, but also to get him around the city. LA County is huge geographically. And so having the cars enabled him to move around the city because he was very concerned about being recognized. He didn't want to burglarize the same places over and over. He wanted to move around. He didn't want the cops closing in on him. Now, along with burglarizing, he was reading. He would read books, but the things he chose to read, you can imagine. So he does read Anton LaVey's book called Satanic Bible, The Satanic Bible. Now, LaVey, okay, I'm going to correct that. And he is reading. So he reads Anton LaVey's book called The Satanic Bible. Now, LaVey was the founder of the Church of Satan, and the book spoke to Richard. The book outlines where, there was zero things to be guilty of because there was zero sin. Absolutely nothing was off the table as far as bad deeds. Bad deeds were good deeds, basically, to Satan worshipers. And so Richard believed in his heart that he had found his religion because all he wanted to do was bad deeds. And he believed that Satan was his leader. And so LaVey was actually down in San Francisco. So Richard does go to San Francisco and he goes to a church service. And afterwards, he does call Mercedes and he asks her to pray for him. He tells her he's been touched by Satan and that she, needs to pray for him. And she tells him, of course, I'm going to pray for you. And she urges him to move home, but he declines. So this is just so interesting to me. He obviously is caught up in his badness, but he still has these tendencies. He's still, you can kind of tell. I mean, obviously, he wants his mom to pray for him. So it's just very conflicting. It's just very interesting. Now, in 1981, Richard is arrested for stealing a car, and he spends several months in jail. Now, between this time, Richard is continuing to, once he's, I will say, blah, 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 blah. Now, in 1981, Richard is arrested for stealing a car, and he spends several months in jail. And then after that time, Richard just continues just an endless cycle of cocaine, stealing, burglarizing houses. It's repeat over and over. Occasionally, he will visit a sex worker. That's what he was doing. He hardly ever saw his family. When he did, his family began to notice how extremely unhealthy he was. He had always been thin, but he was super thin. He had lost weight. He had completely stopped caring about hygiene. he had a very strong, disgusting, like, body odor because he wasn't washing. He didn't care. He didn't wash his clothes. He didn't wash his body. He was disgusting. He also did not take care of his teeth. And he had like this, he was doing the drugs, but then all he would do is drink sodas and eat junk food. So his teeth were literally rotting. He had so many cavities and they were just rotting. And at times he would have to actually, obviously visit a dentist to get this taken care of. But he was absolutely disgusting as far as his whole appearance and hygiene. I mean, he was disgusting. Now, by the summer of 1983, Julian and Mercedes send Ruth out to LA to try to get Richard home because they kind of hear what's going on. They're kind of checking in on him and they know he's in a bad way. So she takes the bus out to LA. She's looking for Richard downtown. She does get with Ruben. He's still there and he helps her look for Richard. They do finally find him. He's hanging out at the Greyhound bus terminal downtown LA. And Ruth recalls that Richard was just different. Like his eyes, she said, were completely dark. They were hard and uncaring when he looked at her. And she implored him to move home. And all he said was he was protected by Satan. And then he did cocaine in front of her. So she left absolutely heartbroken and went back to El Paso. Like she just thought he is just lost. He's lost his way. And she could not get him back. Now, on July 27th, 1984, Richard is hanging out as his usual downtown, place to hang out, which is the Greyhound terminal. He's dressed all in black. That's what he always wore because it made it easier for him to hunt in the dark and whatnot. So he had black socks. He wore black shoes. He had a black baseball hat or a dark baseball hat. He just figured it was just best for him when he was stealing to be all in dark because he goes out in dark. Now, around 8:30 that night, he scores 2 grams of cocaine from a man named Roberto, who was a Colombian dealer who hung out at the Greyhound station. Now, on that day, Richard was driving around in a dark blue Toyota that he had stolen. And he typically, during that time, he was staying like in hotels. He would just hotel hop. He could stay at the Huntington, the infamous Cecil Hotel, the Roslyn, and all of these little hotels went for about $8 to $12 a night. And they didn't require ID to rent. So he was sleeping in the hotels, he was sleeping in the car. Now, he would stay at these hotels. He would binge on cocaine for days. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't eat. Like, that's all he did. But on this night of June 27th, he was going out. By midnight on June 28th, 1984, Richard is driving around and he makes his way over to Glassell Park, a small community of around 42,000 people, about 6 miles or so from downtown LA. Now, he always wore gloves whenever he went to burglarize homes, and that night he had on some dark gardening gloves. He finds a 2-story pink apartment building in what he believes is a very good neighborhood for stealing. Like, he felt like the apartments were nice and the people had a lot of things for him to steal. So he walks around the building. He's kind of looking for the perfect apartment when he sees apartment number 2. And inside this apartment is 79-year-old Jennie Vincow. Now, Jennie is tall and thin, and she has thinning white hair, and she had actually moved to LA from Brooklyn, New York, and her son Jack, who lived in apartment 9, had moved her there to be close to him because she had been living with his brother Manny and things weren't going well, and so Jack wanted to take care of Jennie and he wanted her to be close to him. Now, Richard noticed that one of the windows in apartment number 2 is opened, but there is a screen over that window. So Richard does remove one of his gloves so that he can remove the screen from the window to get access into the apartment. Well, he gets into the 1-bedroom apartment and he's looking around, looking for what he can steal, and he gets angry. He gets very angry. There are 0 valuables. There was hardly any furniture in the apartment, and he is livid. Now, Richard had brought with him a 6-inch razor-sharp hunting knife. He finds Jennie asleep in her bed, and he plunges the knife deep into her chest, just right above her heart. He continues to stab her, in the chest, he gets arm and other areas, and then he proceeds to slash her neck from ear to ear, nearly severing her head from her body. He attacks her with more stabs, even more to her neck, arms, more to her chest. He then ransacks her apartment. He gets a drink in her kitchen. He washes his hands in her bathroom, and then he leaves the apartment. The next day, around 1:20 p.m., Jennie's son Jack comes by the house to check on her. He normally does. This is a normal thing. He knows she loves McDonald's, so he wanted to pick her up and take her to get some food. Now, he goes into the apartment. He finds Jennie's bloodied, dead body, and she is under a blanket. Like, he doesn't even move her. He just runs out of the apartment screaming. He says, "My mother has been murdered. Oh, God, please call the police." Now, the managers at the apartments, Lavi and Renee Trinquet, they call 911, and Jack proceeds to run on to his apartment where he also calls 911. And there he is told that the police have been dispatched. So he goes to wait for the police to show up. He is just in shock. He is heartbroken. He is crying. There are just no words. And word spreads around the apartment complex as to what's happening, so a crowd of people are forming. The first officer to arrive is a Lieutenant Buster Alser from LAPD, the Northeast Station. Now, it is a very warm day. It is late June. In LA, it is about 96 degrees. Very warm. The officer notes, goes into the apartment, and he does note that Jennie's murder is sadistic and brutal, like nothing he had ever seen, because he does pull back like the blanket, like he can see more of the wounds. So he calls for the homicide department, and he wants, he immediately starts to get out his crime scene tape and starts securing the scene. Now, homicide detectives Jesse Castillo and Mike Wynn, they arrive. So they notice the screen is removed. They notice the blood in the bathroom, and then they call for the fingerprint people and the photographer, the criminalist, and then someone from the coroner's office. Now, John Herrera from the medical examiner's office, he arrives, and they do collect the blanket that had been put on Jennie, and then they also collect all the other items like the screen and different things. They do note that Jennie had defensive wounds on her hands. They note that her blue nightgown she was wearing was pushed up, and then the crotch of her girdle that she was wearing was cut. And they do think that she was sexually assaulted. Now, based on just looking. Now, she does have a deep stab wound to her left inner thigh, as well as the other stab wounds. Now, Herrera makes a cut in her liver area, so he can stick a thermometer in to kind of see the temperature. And her liver temperature was 94 degrees. And then he noted that the room temperature was 81 degrees. And again, the outside temperature is 96. He did feel like she had been dead 8 to 10 hours by that time. Now, the LAPD fingerprint expert, Ronaldo Clara, he shows up and he dusts everything for prints. He does find 0 prints in the apartment, but there is also a new way for them to find prints, which is a chemical spray. So he doesn't want to spray down the apartment just yet, so they have to kind of wait until the whole scene has been searched before they do that. Now, by the next day, they do spray the chemical compound, and they find 0 prints from the spray. However, they had taken, the window screen that they had noticed, and they do find 4 fingerprints on the window screen that are good prints. They do, of course, canvass the neighborhood. They talk to all of the people in the apartments and everything, and there are absolutely 0 witnesses that heard or saw anything happen. By June 29th at 11 a.m., a Dr. Joseph Kogan, he handles the autopsy, and he notes the killer was very meticulous as far as his confidence. He knew what he was doing. His cuts, he was confident in what he did. So he felt like this killer was very experienced. Now, the police are absolutely stumped. Jack Vincow is devastated, and Richard has gotten away with this horrific, brutal murder of Jennie. Now, all for this portable radio that he ended up stealing, okay? Now, over the next 8 months, Richard goes back to his usual routine. So he is committing 2 to 3 burglaries a day. He takes items like coin and stamp collections, VCRs, TVs, answering machines, like any electronics that he can grab, anything and everything. He has a dealer that he can get the items to, and then he can get money and then drugs. And so this is just what he is focused on for the next 8 months, all while thinking about his next murder, thinking about, what he did to Jennie and what he's going to do in the future. Now, nothing happens until March 17th of 1985. So on Sunday, March 17th, this is also St. Patrick's Day. So Richard is in a stolen car. He also has a .22 caliber revolver. It's around 10 p.m. and he is cruising around the suburb of Rosemead. This is another, LA community neighborhood and has about 46,000 people. So he spots a woman driving, like she's driving her car, and he decides to follow her. Her name is Maria Hernandez. She is 22 years old. She is petite. She is attractive. She is driving to a newer condo on Village Lane, and she shares this condo with her roommate, 34-year-old Dale Okazaki. Now, Dale has a green Toyota wagon, which is already kind of parked in the garage where Maria is heading, like she's pulling in. And Dale has a very good job. She is a traffic supervisor with the LA County. She comes from a very supportive, loving family. She had attended Pasadena City College and graduated there. She was very active. She was an avid skier. She took classes in decorating, arranging flowers, computer programming, self-defense. Like, as you can see, she was like highly motivated, loved life, loved living life, and loved learning. Like she loved it. Now, Maria parks in the garage. So she does have a garage. She parks in the garage, and without even realizing that Richard has followed her. So he is just telling her he is right behind her, and he is stealthy. Okay. This is nothing new for Richard. So Richard follows her, and he literally follows her into her garage. Like, she has pushed the button, and he gets into the garage before it can close and before she even realizes it. So she does turn around, she glimpses him, and then he's literally walked right up to her with his gun raised, and he immediately pulls the trigger. She screams. She had thrown her hands up when she had seen him. And in that process, like, he was shot, like she was shot in the hand, but actually her keys had saved her because the keys deflected the bullet from doing any more damage to her. So she falls to the floor of the garage. She just plays dead. She is not unconscious. She's hurt, but she is just plain dead. She is stunned. And he just thinks that he shot her and she's down. So she is just laying there. So Richard walks in the house. He sees Dell in the kitchen. So Dell sees Richard, and she ducks immediately behind the kitchen counter. Now, Dell is wearing a Dodgers t-shirt and faded jeans. She's a very pretty woman with straight black hair. And he just waits. Like, Ramirez, he's so creepy. He just stands there with his gun, just waiting for Dell to move. Like, he knows she's going to move, and he is just waiting. And so he's waiting, and he's watching, and he's being totally still. Like, she has no idea what he's doing. Now, in the meantime, Maria is in the garage. So she opens the garage door, and she runs out. Like, she has no idea what to do, but she just knows she's got to get away from this man. Now, in the kitchen, Dale, finally, after several moments of silence, of just waiting, and this is just killing me, like, thinking about this is just absolutely awful, but she finally raises her head, and immediately Richard shoots her right in the forehead, and she falls to the kitchen floor dead. Now, Richard, he leaves the condo via the front door. Now, Maria had made her way to the front of the condo as well, and they see each other, and she screams, "Please, please don't kill me." and she ducks behind an orange Volkswagen bus that was parked out there. He sees her, he listened, and he just ran off. He runs off. He gets back into his stolen car. He doesn't take another shot at her. He doesn't go after her, and just leaves. And she's of course relieved and stunned. Now, Richard is not through with murdering that night, but this is where I'm going to leave you guys. So we will discuss where Richard goes after leaving Maria alive, and then what happens at Maria and Dale's place on the night of March 17th, 1985, as far as the investigation goes. Now, a little side note, I am very aware of another murder committed by Richard that happened actually before he killed Jennie. So it happened in April of 1984. However, that murder was never tied to Richard until DNA evidence in 2009. So just FYI, that's why I didn't get into it, but I will discuss it in part 2. So thank you so much for listening. Leave me a comment, leave me a rating, hug your families, and yeah. And the next part 2 will be a lot more. It'll come next week. So love you guys. Have a great week. Bye.